That's when you know it's official. Shama, are we good to get started? Yep. Okay. Hello, good evening, everyone. Y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Welcome to CAPAL's Washington Leadership Program. My name is Karim Farishta, and I serve on the board of directors for the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership, or CAPAL. I'm also currently serving as the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. I'm obviously here in my personal capacity and volunteer with the CAPAL board. And at CAPAL, we cultivate Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander public service leaders by providing opportunities for formative professional development opportunities and growth opportunities across their early careers. This includes our annual public service scholarship and internship program, a roundtable series, mentorship programs, and tonight's Washington Leadership Program. Our 2024 WLP series was pulled together by a group of our recent scholars and interns and our alumni. So we are incredibly grateful for their partnership, their friendship, and their support. For tonight's discussion, we are excited to welcome Guzman, Ebony White, Chingcha Vang, and Bianca Anderson to our panel discussion today. Tonight's session is about cross-community building and solidarity in 2024, where we'll discuss topics such as cross-community coalition building and the nuances that exist in building connections both within and outside the AANHPI community, as well as avenues to uplift all of our communities. There's also going to be an audience survey that follows the panel discussion. We'll have panelists respond to audience Q&A at the end. We invite you to stay until the end of the session for our networking session, where we hope you can meet with folks from our board and leaders from our community. We encourage you to use and follow the hashtag for today's conversation, #WeAreCAPAL, to post about today's conversation online on your social media. And thank you to our speakers and to our panelists for joining us this evening, for sharing their time. And a very special thank you to our 2024 CAPAL sponsor, the DC Mayor's Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Leadership, or MOAPIA, for making tonight's program possible and for supporting CAPAL through and through year after year. And I'm thrilled to now welcome our panelists. And before we start, just to get a sense of who's in the room, can you raise your hand if you're affiliated with CAPAL? And raise your hand if you're a summer intern. Okay, and raise your hand if you are currently an intern in DC, but not associated with CAPAL. Awesome. Okay, and then just another sampling. Do we have, is everyone an undergrad, grad student? So if you're undergrad, raise your hand. Grad students, working. Great, okay. So we are so excited to have today's discussion. We'll try to keep it as informal as possible. We have about 45 minutes for conversation, and then we'll open it up to discussion and questions. So start thinking about questions that you all may have. We'll just go around quickly, have the panelists share their name, where they work, and just a little brief description about what they do. So Bianca, let's start with you.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Bianca Anderson. Really happy to be here with you. I'm co-CEO of ProInspire, and our organization is a capacity builder or leadership development organization, and our work centers racial equity. So we work with individual leaders and organizations as they work to embody their values around equity and justice.
Great. So I'm Guzman. I'm the director for the Mayor's Office on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs here in Washington, D.C., under our mayor, Muriel Bowser. And yeah, so, our office is the largest kind of its kind in the country. So God bless folks in California. I know we're at the UCDC Center. How many Californians are here? Yeah, so I'm actually a Cal alum, and I am sometimes obnoxious about it, so you'll have to forgive me in advance. But Yeah, no, so it's with much love to our colleagues in Minnesota, Washington State, California, some of the other offices, statewide offices of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs. We've been around for 37 years. Again, we're the largest office of our kind that centers Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders as a local government agency. So I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Ben. Ebony?
Hello, everyone. Ebony White. I'm the owner of Paramount Equity Consulting and happy to be with you all today. Does it count that I was born in California? Well, the work that I do is really supporting specifically philanthropic stakeholders and nonprofits, organizations who are looking to advance economic wealth building, health equity programs for underserved communities. And so I provide technical assistance. I also do training around how to use data. So how to analyze data, how to use it to inform your work, how to use it to be a tool for advocating, educating others around disparities, and really how to leverage data versus thinking about it as something that's just something additional that you need to do. I also do some technical assistance just around how to design human-centered, data-driven programs and designs that's specifically around communities of color. And so looking forward to having this conversation with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Ebony. And then to Chingcha, who is joining us virtually.
Yeah, thanks, Karim. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks for the thumbs up. Hi, everyone. My name is Chingcha. I believe I met a few of you all last month in person. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm calling out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, born and raised in Wisconsin. My current role is Senior Program Manager at LEAP. LEAP is short for Leadership Education for Asian Pacifics. It sounds similar to Bianca's work, so I'm excited to be on this call with you, Bianca, where we provide leadership development for AANHPI leaders across various sectors, including public service or public sector, nonprofit, corporate. We work with students, student organizations, etc. And so I'm excited to be here with you all. And one final thing I'll note is that I am a current board member of CAPAL. So you can see the background. And so really happy to be here and share space with you all as panelists and with our students and interns.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chingcha. I am so excited about this conversation because we are truly joined by giants who care about cross-racial and cross-community culture and care about coalition building. Coalitions aren't built overnight. They are built through trust and respect and responsibility. And those are themes that we continue to highlight at CAPAL, because when we think about public service, isn't just the empowerment of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community. It's about the empowerment of all of our minority communities together so that everyone can succeed. So we'll start with Bianca and Ebony with this first question, which is thinking about what first inspired you or drew you to the sector that you're working in. And if you could just talk us through that pathway, because the other thing that we all know in public service is there are no straight paths. And Bianca actually got her start off in education. So I'll let her share a bit about that.
Thank you. Yes. So I started my career as a classroom teacher. I taught kindergarten, second grade, and then middle school. And as I was teaching, my first teaching school was 90% African-American students. So most of our kids were on like free or reduced lunch. And I was like, okay, it's cool. We have the same socioeconomic background. They're all Black kids. So everything's going to be like really similar, right? But it wasn't, because often our racial identities get collapsed, right? We can get monoliths into, if you're this racial identity, everybody's the same. But really, one of the things I saw very evident in the classroom was that all of my students had different needs that were often unmet because they were grouped together. And that reminded me of my own experiences. When I was growing up in school, my full name is Bianca Mercedes Casanova Anderson, but I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and my skin color has been the same my whole life. And so when I would say my name, people would look bewildered. And they would have kind of a little frown on their face, like, well, where are you from? Where are your people from? And having to explain, my grandmother was from Panama. My grandfather was from Cuba. My mother is first generation. Having to just explain was so tiresome. And I wanted to just like change my name when I was a child. So fast forward, when I'm a teacher, I see how our education system and so many of the things around young people's lives really boxed them in, really created like a monolithic type of experience. And that was the thing that I wanted to change. I wanted to expand the way that young people, particular Black kids, can show up in school, right? And be valued for their essence, for exactly who they are. And so my career has really been about paying it forward. So remembering those experiences that I had, whether it was as a child or as a classroom teacher, and wanting to leave the place better than I found it, wanting to do something for those who were coming after me so they wouldn't have the same barriers or challenges that I've had. So that's really what has propelled me forward in the next steps of my career, is thinking about what was really messed up about this thing and what would I want to do differently for those who are coming behind me.
Thank you. And Ebony, I imagine that you didn't just one day end up at Paramount Equity. And the pathway to learning about and thinking about equity is one that's built off of a lot of professional experiences. So could you perhaps talk us through your journey and what that looked like?
Yeah, definitely. So I've always had a desire and passion and just want to give back to the community. My mother was very community driven, always had me out doing volunteering before I even knew what that was. But it also gave me just a perspective that people always have it worse than you. And even though we didn't have much, I learned to appreciate what we did have. And as I began to work in the just career, the first thing I did was youth development work. And one of the things that I noticed by doing this work was that I was I was confused about where resources was coming from and how it was actually being dispersed throughout communities. And it put me on this path where I found myself at the Catalog Foundation, and I wanted to be part of where the money was, to be honest. I wanted to be able to be part of being able to make decisions around where it was going, because I did not see it being put in the communities that needed it most. And so as I was working at the Catalog Foundation, it really gave me the privilege to not only be able to think about systems and how they interact with each other, how they impact families' abilities. And so being able to work across education, health, economic, and even civic engagement, all those things, it really helped me to think about how these issues really impact vulnerable families and vulnerable kids. And then at the same token, I had the opportunity to do a lot of work around racial healing. And so that gave me the opportunity to not only think of beyond the systems, but to think about the interpersonal side of the work that doesn't get talked about a lot. But to be honest, it's just as important. And so it gave me the opportunity to really think about how the shifts, not only the systems, but the hearts and the minds of the individuals who are making decisions behind these decisions that's really impacting communities. And I feel like if we want to really create a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, we really need to think about how we can really have equal value across all human beings, because there is this fundamental belief that's embedded into our systems around a hierarchy of human value. We need to dismantle that, to be honest, just dismantle it and really create some conditions that's equitable for everyone. And so as I have build out my career over the 20 plus years, I really have been able to bring that lens to all the work that I do. And that it's not about just systems, but it is the people too. They both are equally important. And it might be the soft work, but that is the work that really shifts, to me, the hearts that we need to do in our society.
I love what you're getting at, because it reminds me of this quote from an abolitionist, which says, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. And we have nothing to lose but our chains." And in the work of racial healing is about losing those chains, right? About moving the conversation forward. And it's beginning to equalize a playing field that for so long hasn't allowed people the opportunities that they deserve. So I'm going to switch the conversation over to Ben and to Chingcha to just talk us through, what do you do every day at work? And if we could hone in on a particular instance, that moment where you're like, this is why I do what I do, and this is why it's so impactful. And just tell us that story of, okay, when I was working with community, I was able to achieve X. And that's when I knew the work that I was doing was really important. So Ben, over to you.
Um, well, I should acknowledge that my colleagues just walked in. So Vicky is here in our office, who runs our grant program and our language access program, as well as Hannah, who is with us this summer. I think that I spent a career in the nonprofit sector for good almost 20 years working with a lot of the AANHPI advocacy groups. I spent some time at LEAP Chingcha. I was one of the co-founders for the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance. And it's really been only in the past 6 years that I've had this pivot to do local work for the mayor. And, there are so many moments here in Washington, D.C. where, at the risk of being cliche about it, you're in the room when it happens. Like you recognize that, some bill has been signed or some meeting, some historic milestone has been reached. But locally, I think what's been really most rewarding is that you actually get to see the people whom you're affecting. So we walk in Chinatown and we see the seniors that live in Wallach House, the low-income housing kind of senior center there, and they'll smile at you because they know that they are there because of the housing incentives that, that we were able to get them to buy their own building. They know that we are there because the extra additional measures that we've taken to address public safety in the neighborhood are working. So to see them smile at you and like you just know that that's the needle that you're always trying to push forward, move, right? So I think in terms of this phase of my career, that's the moment that, that keeps me going.
I love that. Chingcha, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Ben, good to meet you. And good to know that you spent some time with LEAP. I think for me, how I approach this question is, well, in my day-to-day, I kind of shared a little bit what I do a little already. But how I got here is, I think, more interesting and lends a better answer to your question, Karim. I grew up in a small rural town in a predominantly white area in Wisconsin. There was very little diversity. Because of that, I grew up and I started associating what like leadership was, what success was with like white American values. That's just literally like who the leaders in my town were like white American cisgender males, right? And so being Hmong American, and I'm very kind of upfront about my ethnic identity. Hmong Americans historically in this country have very low levels of high school and college attainment rates. We have high levels of poverty, low levels of English proficiency. Although some of those things are changing with like more like children and more generations being a part of this country, it's still really important for me to acknowledge all that because the most important thing for me, the most impactful moments for me is actually being able to create space for communities of leaders, especially the AANHPI leaders, in which I get to design programming for their specific needs. So I went from having no role models that look like me to then creating space for people to be role models, right? For youth and for younger folks that are striving to reach certain heights, creating pathways for certain people. And so I would say like those are the most impactful moments for me. One specific example of that was in early June, where I got to meet a lot of our CAPAL SNI cohort members during their orientation leadership week. So got to run a workshop from LEAP there and got to meet so many of our young and inspiring young people in the CAPAL program. Just being able to interact with them during that moment, but beyond as a mentor, as someone who checks in with our CAPAL SNI, those are the moments that keep me going. And I would be remiss if I didn't share, similar to, again, Bianca, I started my career as a high school teacher in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I deeply believe that every experience that we all have really contribute to the impact that we all make in the now, but also in the future. And so I would never have ended up doing leadership development work if I didn't have no role models growing up. I wouldn't be a facilitator and speaker if I didn't actually spend time in the classroom, not just working with students, but with parents and community members. And so this topic for this WLP lands a special place in my heart, for sure.
Thanks, Chingcha. I'm literally getting goosebumps as he's speaking about this because I can sense how palpable the sense of community building and leadership development is in this room. And that's why we're so excited about you all. Because we truly hope that one day you're going to be sitting on this side of the room and you're going to be talking to the next generation of leaders and telling them why solidarity shouldn't be an afterthought, but should be built into the work that we do. So I'm going to go into a question for Bianca, and then we'll just do one by one. And I'll ask everyone a slightly different version of a similar type of question is, why is building solidarity so important today? And what is changing in this landscape that if we don't do it, we're going to get it wrong?
Okay, so why is solidarity important today? So a lot of my work is guided by principles of Black feminist thought. And the Combahee River Collective, there's a line that talks about none of us are free until we all are free. We are not single issue people, right? So I was born into intersectionality, right? I don't know anything else. And often as a Black woman, you can either be like, you're a woman or you're Black, but you can't be both, right? And that's not okay, right? And we know that's not actually true. So when I think about solidarity, it's actually us being more authentic about what is real in society. What is real is there are multiple issues that we are all impacted by, regardless of our race or our gender, right? When I think about solidarity, I often think about it around like cross-racially, because that's where my work lives. And so why is it so important today is when I look at the workforce, right? We are becoming the global majority, right? People of color. And feeling like our issues are siloed is not gonna get us to freedom, you know? And so solidarity is really important now because when I look at the workplace and I look at young people who are coming out of school, I see more and more folks who are parents are from places outside of the US. I see more and more folks who have multiracial backgrounds, right? And so just getting to a place where we all can be free, you know, is why it's important. And it's even more important now because if we don't, we are staring fascism and like collective catastrophe if we don't.
I love what you're getting at, which is saying solidarity as a conduit to freedom, right? So there's freedom from, and then there's freedom for, right? And I think Bianca is getting at both of those elements, freedom from X, but also freedom for our people. And what does that look like? So I want us to take a step back and think historically. So this question is for Ben and for Ebony. What are those moments in history where you think solidarity was truly defined? And as you look at the movements of solidarity that are going on today, have we arrived and how far do we need to go? So Ebony or Ben, whoever wants to start.
You want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, so when I think about some historical events, I mean, to be honest, we can go back to the civil rights era. A lot of people don't really pay attention to the full story and all the different types of activists that were involved. It also makes me think about narrative change and how if you take things for what's on the surface, you might miss a lot of good information and a lot of good context. If I think about, let's just say like the Black Panther Party, for example, they're known for being violent, they're known for being anti-white. That was not the case. Like there were so many different other activist groups that they worked with because they knew that they were not going to be able to reach the socialism that they were striving for by themselves. So they actively had a lot of multiracial coalitions where they worked across Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Chinese, even some poor groups that advocated for poor whites. But that's not told. That's not in our history books. And so when you think about the work that's been happening in this space, it's been happening for a long time. The thing about it is when it comes to media, when it comes to who's telling the stories of how we come together, it for those people on the other side who don't want us to work together, they're working very hard to keep that stuff on the low. Even if we fast forward to everything that was happening around George Floyd, we had people walking across all type of walks of life, race, ethnicities in the US, outside the US, like even coalition, I want to say, wasn't there like an Asian American Agents for Black Lives Matter or something like that? Like, yeah, it was so many things that were developed. And so it's not a new concept. I think the problem is that we only do it in numbers under crisis. I think there's an opportunity for us to do those numbers where we're being more proactive and not being reactive to something that's happening. And I think that's the space where we really need to work more collectively, be more intentional about it, because again, it has been happening in our history for a long time. We have definitely, we're stronger together, period. If we want to fight oppression, if we want to fight racism, all these things that's very much thriving today in our world, we need to come together, and that's how we can really dismantle a lot of these things and create a new society that just works better for all of us collectively. Because as Bianca mentioned, we are the majority.
Thanks, Ebony.
No, I think that's right. I was trying to think through all of the kind of historical moments, and I actually landed on the civil rights movement also, in the sense that the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. A year afterwards, the Immigration and Naturalization Act was passed in 1965. So that kind of political space that made the Civil Rights Act possible also opened the door for the US to change its essentially racist quota immigration laws, right? And more importantly, it created the idea of family immigration. So at the risk of asking a question, how many folks here are either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants, right? How many people here came to the US through a family visa from, either their parents, or maybe people aren't as aware of that. So that, again, the political space that created that opportunity for us and for America to diversify itself was made possible by Black folks that pushed for, civil rights, not just for them, but for all of us, right? And the irony is that, the family quotas were essentially created as sort of an instrument of white supremacy. Like they thought, oh, well, families, most of the families that are here are white, so, whatever. And then all of a sudden people started coming in, and then they brought their families. And so it created the diversity that we now know today, right? So there's so many other examples. I mean, at the risk of getting through the traffic that got us here, you mentioned the idea of building coalitions, and it's been talked about elsewhere, kind of not when we need them, but when we have the space to build them. These days, sometimes it feels like we're always in crisis mode. And we do have to take moments like this to appreciate the kind of opportunities that we have to build multicultural coalitions. So, we're not in crisis now, so let's do some of that tonight.
So often when you think about history, we think about dates in the past. One of the dates that I want to put on your radar is 2026. That's the year that America turns 250. It is a big opportunity for us to think about how far we've come and how much further we need to go, right? Because that's when America turns 250. But if you look at something like the 1619 Project, it talks about how America's story begins long before she was created, right? So there's this idea that a story is told from the arc of a nation, and then there's a story that is told from the arc of a people. And I think it's very important for us to keep those ideas in mind. And where does the Asian American community fit in, right? The construction of the transatlantic system, right? Of thinking about the folks who came to build the railroads in this country, the murder of Vincent Chin, There are moments that have defined American history and the tragic shootings that took place in Atlanta, right? Those are all part of this story of the Asian American community. But then there's the stories of 9/11, right? There's the Muslim American community that's part of the Asian American community. There's the story of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So let's think not just about dates in the past, but dates in the future. And how are those dates in the future going to be benchmarks for where we want to be? So I want to take a question up to Chingcha. As we think about these nuances, what are some of the phenomena that we should keep in mind as we think about community building across races, across cultures? And the important part here is both within and outside the Asian American community. What are those things that we're missing? And can you shed some light on how we can keep those front and center?
Yeah, I think my fellow panelists, I was thinking about Palestine while folks were talking. So I'm gonna actually bring that up in a moment. But I still can't say it. The other panelists have already shared that a lot of the BIPOC communities struggles, challenges are rooted within the same systemic policies and thought patterns that are designed to keep BIPOC communities down, right? Immigrant communities down, low-income communities down. I like to think of one specific example to Wisconsin that is a great example of an organization that builds communities and relationships across Black and Southeast Asian communities. And this organization is called Freedom Inc. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe you haven't. They're a small but really mighty organization that's led by Black and Southeast Asian queer leaders, folks that I really look up to and inspire me to continue kind of challenging and unlearning and kind of interrogating the ways in which I grew up thinking about certain things. This organization is a Black and Southeast Asian nonprofit based in Madison. They work with low to no income communities of color. They focus largely building space and community and capacity for gender justice, queer justice, and Black and Southeast Asian liberation. I bring this up because recently, in the spring, they played a huge role across the last 25 years in getting Senate Bill 240 passed in Wisconsin, which requires all K through 12 schools to teach Hmong and Asian American history, right? And so that was a huge milestone that was not nearly covered enough across the country. But it's organizations like these that have taken the time to build vulnerable trust, to build relationships, for them to show up for each other in moments of need, but also as Ben and others have said from the panel, have taken the time to build that trust when they're not in crisis mode, right? So that when the needle needs to move, when the conversation needs to move, communities show up for each other, right? And so one thing that I like to think about specifically is how do people become allies, right? And I know that that question's probably coming up later, but in my kind of just in my experience, kind of receiving allyship, but also being an ally for folks, it's really about showing up and showing out, right? And leaning into those that are most affected, most marginalized, and using and leveraging my privilege and my power in whatever way that makes sense to uplift the voices that are most affected. And so I've been able to largely look to a lot of the Black and Southeast Asian queer community leaders to really guide my thinking again, in how I'm kind of learning and unlearning what coalition building means, what cross-racial community building means. I'll pause there. I was going to mention a thing about Palestine, but I'll pause there for now because I know we're running short on time.
Thanks, Chingcha. As I'm hearing all of our panelists share their insights, I am realizing that we're in this imaginative space, right? The world as it should be versus the world as it is. And I think it's really important, especially as interns, to envision the America that can be rather than the America that is. And that's why CAPAL is so special. It's an opportunity to think about where public service should be. But we're also pragmatic, and we realize that there are real systemic barriers at play. So I'm going to ask Ebony and Bianca a question around barriers. We've imagined where we want to be, but we realized that there are systemic barriers in place. Can you just magnify what some of those barriers are and tell us, how do we begin to overcome these racial, religious, social, economic barriers that we continue to see?
Mhm. Yeah, I can start.
Sure.
So one of the systemic barriers I think about just in my own life, but then in society more broadly, is redlining. And just where people live, where certain people could live historically and couldn't live. Because we know that I'm from Texas, and we had no public transportation system, right? So my family was like, could only live in this neighborhood. We had white flight, there other families could only live in this neighborhood. We have no public transportation. Well, I actually don't get to build trust, right? Before a catastrophe, right? And then it feeds that fear of difference, fear of the other. Because just like there are stereotypes around Black folks, there are stereotypes around Asian folks, right?
Mhm.
And if I don't spend time with folks and get to know them as humans, then what the world will do is dehumanize us to one another, right? And then all of our systemic barriers, they confirm that, right? So they keep us separate. But I think specifically about like redlining, access to transportation, schooling, those things that would allow us to be in space together that actually work to separate us.
Thank you. Ebony?
Yeah, so to build on what Bianca is saying, I also think intentionality, meaning everybody, you can't use one strategy to connect or reach out to a group the same. You have to really take the time to understand how to engage in their community, how to understand what is the connection points, what is it that you have in common. Through some work that I did, called the Truth Racial Healing and Transformation Initiative. It was something that was done during my tenure at the Kellogg Foundation. That to me is a guide. It's a guidebook that really looked at several different sectors, just to name a few, looking at things like separation was one of them. The law was one of them. Health was one of them. Because one of the things that beyond just how we're separated within communities is our sectors, they don't talk, but they really impact each other and impact the work that we're trying to do in a much needed way. And a lot of times when they need to collectively come together, they don't have those relationships. They don't have those safe spaces together to even be able to think about what does it mean to actually work collectively together. And so what I liked about the TRHT was that it was really grounded around not only the systems that impact children and families, but the racism that's embedded within all of it. And really, how can we create some guidance to communities, whether that is your neighborhood, it could be your organization, it can be your community. And so we worked with over 130 experts across different industries, sectors, walks of life, to really come together and think about what does it mean for different communities within and across communities to come together to not only create space to be able to understand how we all have been impacted by these systems and our families have been impacted by these systems, but to understand how we are all coming to this. And because once we do that, it actually makes it easier to be able to have some of the harder conversations around the systems piece of it. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up, because this was something that was implemented in 2016. We have 14 different cities that actually took this on. And since then, not only do we have some lessons learned to really think about some of those barriers and some solutions, but they actually just recently came out with another updated guideline. So I think we have some things to learn from too, right? Where we're not always working in crisis mode, but how can we expand on efforts like those? And how can we think about being able to activate these systems? And so one of the things I'll say learnings that came out of that was you not only need to know how to activate the systems and the institutions, but the people. The people who are like really impacted by these systems need to be part of the conversation. They need to be leading it, to be honest. And when we're thinking about people, it's not only across race and ethnicity, but also it's everything from how can we literally unlike the energy of young people to really also harass it, like, not harassing, but harnessing, not harassing. Harnessing, just the insight of our elders, right? So how, because that's another thing, like with some of the work that I've done, we don't bring them two together. And when we do, it's like, well, they don't take us seriously enough, or, and then the elders are saying, oh, well, they think they know it all. It's so it's like, how can we create space for people to actually learn just the assets and the strengths that we all bring to each other? And I think there's just a lot of more opportunity for us to think about what that looks like within and outside communities.
Thank you. So one of the responses to barriers is creating allyship. So I'm going to hand it over to Ben, who has been working on this for such a long time in the Asian American community. So what can AANHPI community members do as allies, and what does allyship look like for our community?
Well, I think Chingcha and other folks have already spoken to this in the sense that, excuse me, we're all stronger together, right? But what that says to me is that allyship is not just the right thing to do. It's politically the smart thing to do, right? So to build power across communities means that we are better able to be more successful, to be able to invoke allies that can provide political cover for you, that can say the things that can speak truth to power in ways that you can't, or tell different sides of a narrative that you can't, are effective strategies, right? So as I had an example, I think that, and part of it for me is storytelling, right? So, just because it's the right thing to do doesn't mean that you'll do it. So if you need, or that someone else will do it, right? So if you need to tell them that story of why it's important, then you have any number of stories, right? So I saw a dear friend of mine at the Asian Pacific Islander Americans Health Forum event the other day, and we were both doing civil rights work in the AANHPI community 20 years ago this year. And marriage equality was just happening, right? Marriage equality had in fact been happening in Hawaii 10 years previously, when they went through their own Supreme Court journey. But on the continental US, places like San Francisco and Massachusetts were grappling with the issue. And so for us as civil rights organizations, we were thinking about well, what is our role, right? Forgetting that the Japanese American Citizens League was, had its own historic moment supporting marriage equality. You should read it in Helen Zia's book, Asian American Dreams. It's a really sort of neat telling of that story. But, I was sitting literally at the table as the only openly gay person in the room. But my friend, who is now on the board of the Health Forum, as a straight ally, was the one who said, well, we should be doing this. This is a civil rights issue. And for whatever reason, I hadn't felt like it was my place to push. But once she said it, that allowed me to kind of be more openly myself, to talk about what it meant for me. And then ultimately be given more work and having to kind of carry that through. But yeah, no, I think that it was actually in that moment too, the mid 2000s, where so many of our AANHPI people were the leading faces in many of the civil rights issues. So if folks remember Dan Choi, who was the face of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, if folks remember, the folks in Hawaii who were part of the cases for marriage equality 10 years before it was happening on the continental US, we have always been kind of at the center of a lot of these issues. So it makes it even more important for us to tell our stories, because we can make those connections of allyship, not just for people showing up for us, but more importantly, us showing up for other people on other issues.
I love that. And Ben, without being prompted, has shared this idea of building power, which is exactly where I wanted to end it. I have a last question for all the panelists. It's going to be rapid fire. And if you're online, please start thinking about questions that you have for our panelists. If you're sitting here, start thinking about questions that you want to ask. We're going to have about 15 to 20 minutes to ask questions. But on power, that's why we're here. We're here to build community power, cross-racial community power, and get you access to positions of power and not just be proximate to them. There's a difference between proximity to power and then being powerful, right? And not power for the sake of vanity, power for the sake of community empowerment. So I want all of our panelists to go through, we're going to start with Chingcha, on what ideas or advice do you have for the students who are in the room, folks who are listening in, about building community power through the lens of public service? How do we continue to push to be in places where we belong and where we're seen, but also bring our communities with us?
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up, Karim. I think the way in which I'm thinking about this question, or some advice I'll share to the audience members who are either like entering or thinking about entering the public sector, the public service sector, is to really like take your time. Like you're not gonna, I would say like you're not gonna get to that impact that you wanna have if you rush towards it. Although some of us, like for me, I was on the opposite side, but some of you all might have this kind of like this career path pictured. I was someone who didn't, but I was lucky enough to start off my career as a teacher, right? In which I mentioned before. And by taking my time through that and actually reflecting on the impact that I was able to make and to continue making through that experience, it totally changed the trajectory of my career, but in the best ways. I became a lot more like values and impact driven. I became much more like cognizant of my social identities and how I kind of impact others by being in the same space as them, became more empathetic. I grew in my resilience. All of these things I name because they can serve me in any kind of career or role that I'm a part of. And so the advice I would leave you all here in kind of relation to like power and kind of inching towards building like collective power for BIPOC communities is like, it's okay to take it slow, take a leap into the unknown, because you never know what your true impact is going to be until you actually just try things, right? Like for me, again, it was teaching, loved it, made some impact, but it changed me in ways in which now I landed in nonprofit. Never thought I was going to do that either, right? Now I'm working explicitly with like AANHPI communities. In other roles, I'm volunteering with CAPAL as a board member and other local organizations. And all of that wouldn't have happened if I just like, if I follow this career trajectory that I thought I was going to take, which again was very muddled from the beginning. But that's my advice for the young folks in the room.
Well, Chingcha's always on message and just used his organization as a verb. So 10 points for him. From one teacher to another, Bianca, over to you.
Yeah. So first, when I think about power, I think about it in three ways: power to, power with, and power within. Often when we talk about power, we talk about power to, right? Which can be like power over, decision-making power, authority. And that is really important power to have, right? As CEO, I have power to. And I would not have my power to if I did not have my power within. And so when I talk about what builds power and then the collective power, I think it's first building your own power within, knowing that we are more than what the society or these stereotypes, these stigmas say about us, right? We all have a purpose. We have something to contribute to the world. The world needs us. It needs you. And so being able to stand in our authentic power and truth, that power within, I think helps to cultivate the power with. Right? Whether it's power within community, power across community. If I'm standing in my power, I can see yours too, and I'm not intimidated by it, right? And so when we build power with, we are able to create lasting change. Adrienne Marie Brown talks about change moves at the speed of trust, right? And power with is trust, right? I trust you to be in solidarity with me. I trust you to do your share. I trust you to have my back and I'll have yours. And so when we can build that power with, I think that's where we get to like collective liberation. We get to places where the collective really does have power.
Great. I love how you're talking about power. And Ebony, from a Paramount equity perspective, what does it mean to build power, and what's your advice for the group?
Yeah, I was, definitely building on what's been said. I think it's important to understand the role that you have and the impact and the influence that you have with those around you. And so before you can really engage with others, I think it's important to do your own self-work. To understand what the biases is that you have. We all have them. It's natural. But I think it's important to understand what they is and how they show up and how you engage with people, how you even make decisions, because those are some of the things that you actually have the ability to be able to change. I think another thing is when you're thinking about who you can influence, don't be afraid to speak up for those who don't have a voice. Don't be afraid to share that power, share that space with others. And so even if you not being asked to, even if you're not being directly impacted, to have the courage to lean in and take that risk and be in an uncomfortable space with others is something that creates opportunity for that shared power, for that shared risk taking. And so when I think about power, I think about also just the risks that we have to take in this type of work. We're not, because of the root issues that's at the bottom of the work that we're trying to do, we're not going to see the impact that we want to see overnight. So I would say definitely stay optimistic, stay flexible, because there's a lot of things in our society that will make you want to hurry up and jump and get to that power too, where you are just putting the hammer down. That's not necessarily the right way to go all the time. And so I would say definitely, pay attention to, again, where you have influence, because we have everything from the pandemic, the injustices that we've seen around police killing, around hate crimes. We have immigration crisis. We have so many things. We have the attack on our democracy that's happening in an election. Like, the list is long and it's exhausting, to be quite honest. I would also say, don't watch the news a lot. That shit would, I'm sorry, I cussed. I didn't mean to. Don't watch the news a lot, because it will drain you. You don't want that. So when you're thinking about that, I'm thinking about it from a self-care place of not only thinking about the power that you have, but also the power that you can share with others, and the power that you can motivate and embed in those around you. Lean into your leadership, lean into the leadership of others, and then that's how we can create just the muscle to be able to have that collective power that we need.
Great. And Ben gets the final word.
In some ways, I think it's what I want to say is not maybe it's the flip side of what other folks have said. And that is that sometimes we're trained not to seek power for ourselves, right? We're more collective, or we're more family oriented. And I would challenge us to be mindful of the trajectory that you talked about, right? Like community building connects to community empowerment, connects to building political power. When I first moved to DC, I had very little sense of what I wanted to do, only that I wanted to kind of be part of changing the world, right? Like, I knew that I wanted to be the change that I wanted to see in the world and whatever, but I was very naive about the political the need for political power to make that happen. Right. So now that I'm here in the position that I'm at, I'm mindful that there's not been an Asian American nor a Native Hawaiian, nor a Pacific Islander in the DC City Council. We only have one person who holds statewide office, and he's in the school board, the superintendent school board. So there are a handful of folks who are in our sort of micro ANC system of like micro government, and they're great. And it's a platform for bigger things. And, you know, it also creates the image that we are not here, that we're not locals, you know, that we haven't had people who've been here for generations. So you may not see yourself as someone holding political office, but it's important to be mindful that if we're building community, it is to build community empowerment, and with the idea that someday, you know, that we will increase the pipeline of people who will hold political office and who will be able to kind of throw the hammer down when they need to.
What a great place to end. So thank you so much to our panelists. We still have a few minutes to go, so I'll hand it over to Hannah to talk about the survey and also to re-engage our group.
All right, awesome. First of all, let's give a huge round of applause for our panelists, Karim, Bianca, Ben, Ebony, and Chingcha. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful and impactful discussion tonight. So for our in-person attendees, you probably saw a paper survey that's going around the room. We do ask for all of our attendees, whether you're online or joining us in person, to complete the attendee survey if possible. Your responses do help keep programs like CAPAL's running year after year. And so as we complete the survey, we will go into the audience Q&A portion. For our virtual attendees, you can drop all questions in the chat box. And then for our in-person attendees, we'll be handing out over mics to you shortly. But to kick off our Q&A, I will actually throw out a question from one of our virtual attendees. So Henry Zhang, who is also one of CAPAL's interns this summer, he says, "Thank you so much for today's session and all of the insight you provided with us today. Could you describe what has been your experience dealing with those barriers and what has been the most effective way to build communities and solidarity? My second question is, what do you think best defines a community?" So this is for any of our panelists.
Nothing like an easy question.
So I'll get us started. So just if I recall the original question, it was around what has been my experience with battling some of the barriers. I go back to really understanding, for one, whenever I'm working with someone or going into a community or going into a group of folks that I'm working with, I never go into anything thinking that I have all the solutions. I always go into communities with solutions. I've typically, as a funder and as a technical assistant, I'm always brought into a community that's not my community. So I think it's very important to not only be top down. You don't want to do that, but you also, you want to actually create space for the community to provide the solutions, to help the key stakeholders, whoever are the resources, who are really like the folks that have the gateways and to what we're trying to do, to really be able to create that space for them to be listened to be heard, to be authentically engaged, and not just ask, but really engage in as the solutioners. And so I think when you're thinking about this work, it need to be grounded in community. It need to be grounded in the group that's been marginalized on whatever the issue is that you're collectively coming together with. I also think that you need to understand that people know what they need, they know what they want. So don't define that for them. I also think, I've done a lot of work in the Native American communities, and you have to understand cultures. So if you're trying to do coalition building, you need to understand and appreciate the different culture lens that we're all bringing to the work. You don't have to agree and do everything, but you have to acknowledge and appreciate it. I think we can coexist and appreciate our differences. And so I think creating that space, again, for us to be able to hear each other, see each other in a really authentic way, I think is very important. I find when you bring folks in from the beginning and then you kind of take it on yourself, that's not helpful, nor is that authentic. They need to be part of it throughout the process. And so keep people engaged, keep the community engaged, I think is very important. I would also say that when you're thinking about coalition building, one of the things that I also see as a barrier is just really trying the momentum of keeping it up. And so when we're thinking about resources, I think you definitely want to understand the resources you have. What is the strategies to keep the resources going? What is the strategy to keep people engaged? How can we think about who's not at the table? So again, asking those questions, having those checkpoints, who's missing that should actually be here? And if they're not here, don't say, oh, well, I've tried. No, try a little harder. You know, don't take the easy route of doing, I reached out one time and they didn't respond. Maybe you just didn't reach out in the right way. You know, so sometimes, especially with specific groups that have been harmed in so many different ways, you're gonna have to work a little harder for them to come to the table and to feel safe to want to even be there. And I would also say, this is not a space to be comparing war stories. It's not the space for that, you know. I think this is a space to share and to acknowledge, because we all want to be acknowledged, we all want to be heard, but it's not about comparing, it's not about pointing fingers. That's not what this is about. So if you bring that kind of energy to the space, it's not going to do nothing but harm the work that you're trying to do. And I don't remember what the second question was.
Well, so the question that I recall was the very simple question of what is community? And what I just wanted to make a point that communities are always defined situationally, right? So as a Filipino American, sometimes we are like, are you Southeast Asian? Well, to the extent that that the Philippines is part of the ASEAN kind of geopolitical union entity or whatever, sure, we're Southeast Asian. Are we Pacific Islander? Well, to the extent that the Philippines are islands in the Pacific, you know, one could make that argument. But are we in a US political kind of environment where Southeast Asian often refers to folks who come from refugee backgrounds and who have a political agenda that thinks about refugee communities and the impact of refugee policy as opposed to immigration policy, as opposed to American colonialism on their communities? Yeah, so to the extent that, you know, maybe I'm not Southeast Asian in a particular room. I think CRAC is having their trainings this coming week. Is that right? They're coming up. But, you know, am I Pacific Islander? You know, to the extent that many of those entities have and still have legacies of American territorial possession, sure. You know, my twin brother was stationed in Guam when I first moved to DC, and we both recognized that neither of us had political representation in Congress. And that was something that we both inherited as part of our legacy as Filipinos. But I would not say that the Pacific Islander struggle is one that I have directly now, right? So I am happy to support, you know, my friends as they're doing advocacy around the Organic Act or Native Hawaiian sovereignty or whatever, but I'm mindful of my position outside of that as an ally. So I think there isn't sort of a platonic definition of community, but it's always shifting about depending on what context you're in.
Any questions in the room? Maybe we can take a couple because we have about 10 minutes to go.
So this requires a little bit of explaining, but hello? Okay. By the way, I'm Hannah. I'm the intern at MOAPIA, and also Karim is my lovely mentor through CAPAL. So I guess as I'm considering working in government, public policy, public service, I've been asking myself this question a lot. Kind of like Black feminist literature, Audre Lorde talks about how we can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. And I'm still conflicted over the answer to that. And so I guess it's like a theory of change question of, do you all think through your personal experience, whether it's working in government or public service, nonprofits, that you can move that needle of change and enact that kind of change, I guess, within the system using the quote unquote master's tools, I guess?
That's a good question. Oh, go ahead. We'll get a few more. So I need to write them down.
Yeah, let's just take a couple. Or else we won't get to everyone's questions.
Oh, do we want to get them together?
Yeah, maybe let's get a
Like
few.
stack them?
Hi, my name is Vang. I'm an OCA intern. This question is also kind of similar to the previous question, and it's a little bit loaded. So are you sure you want to take them all? Okay. This one is also for Bianca. I'm really inspired by a lot of the abolitionist work and abolitionist knowledge that you're bringing to the panel today. So thank you so much for that. You mentioned scholars like Adrienne Marie Brown and Audre Lorde who are very explicitly abolitionists. And as one myself, I'm trying to navigate how to exist in spaces such as the nonprofit space. So how do we as young people or as abolitionist scholars bring these principles and ideologies into these spaces tied to corporate irresponsibility, whether it be nonprofits or federal agencies? Because as an Asian American person, I see a lot of policy initiatives that most often harm other Black and Brown people, but hidden under the guise of protecting the Asian American population. So how do we move towards much more intentional solidarity work?
Whew, I think you probably know more than I do. I think you got an answer. Sorry, we're gonna
Yeah, let's just take
regroup
this
them.
one last question.
Hello.
I wrote it.
Hi, thank you guys so much for sharing your experiences and stories. My name's Meghna. I'm also an OCA intern with Vang. And my question, just a little bit of background as well. I just wanted to kind of touch a bit on like the history of like solidarity, like with the civil rights movement. My own parents came here on H-1B work visas. So kind of like on the flip side of that, there have been moments in history where communities that were in solidarity or tried to be in solidarity have diverged because of like rhetoric from external sources that convinced people that their interests diverged. I'm thinking like the women's movement and like voting rights for Black folks, and how they were convinced that it's either the 15th Amendment or the 19th Amendment, and it can't be both. So in those types of historical moments, when people are trying to divide us, create a wedge, I'm thinking modern times, affirmative action, how do we withstand, resist, and overcome those attempts to divide communities when all of our interests and all of our freedoms are intertwined and are collective? How do we like resist those forces that are trying to put those wedges between our communities?
So, Deepa Iyer, who start with somebody else, somebody who's way smarter. Deepa Iyer, who runs a project called Solidarity Is through Building Movement Project. And they talk about solidarity as a verb, an action, and a strategy. Okay. And so I think that just thinking about it that way has invited me into some of the intentionality, the consistency, and the discipline that is required. Okay, so I just want to start there for the third question. And then I think for the first, like, because I'm gonna try to thread them together. So I think for this first piece around the master's tools. So in social justice work, and I used to be one of them, we can use that quote to like tear everything down and just burn it up, right? And I don't know if that serves us. So I do think sometimes it gets a little oversimplified, right? So when I think about the master is the first part. So if I don't hold the ideologies of the master, is it really their tools, right? Because I think sometimes, particularly with like white supremacy culture, these things, like structure has been in all of our communities in some ways, right? There are things like that can be weaponized to say, oh, these are the master's tools. But if I'm not using the master's ideology, I'm curious if it's still their tool, right? So I do think there's ways to leverage things that were meant for bad for good, right? But it takes intentionality, it takes strategy, and it takes action, right? Because we haven't been the place we're trying to go. You know what I'm saying? And so as we think about abolitionism and we think about, how do we bring the new into the old, it's going to require imagination. It's going to require risk taking. One of the ways that I do it is I think about my values. So I try to think, okay, what are the values that are guiding me today or in my life? And what are the decisions that I can make that are most congruent with those values? So then even if I work in a nonprofit that historically doesn't pay people well, right? The sector, I have to think about my value around equity, living wage, and then I have to make a decision that is in more alignment with that. So that's what I would say kind of there to that piece. And then, yeah, the attempts to like resisting the division piece. Yeah, I just think for me, love is the answer to a lot of this, and division, isolation. I don't know how love can exist there, and so often when I'm kind of faced with those types of decisions, I ask myself, like, what would be the most loving thing to do? And that's a very simple question, but often the answer can guide me to something different, right? So that's what I would say.
Deepa was the person who first hired me when I first entered the civil rights space. And then literally the day that I started, we had at 9:30, we had an all staff meeting and she's like, oh, by the way, I'm leaving. She went on to found SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, and then all these other fabulous things at 9/11 and all the things. But I bring her up also because I wanted to point to her kind of typology of this ecosystem of social justice, right? So I think thinking about the different roles that people play in a social justice ecosystem can help us think better about like our proximity to the master's tools, right? Like some of us are not going to be the ones laying the hammer down. Some of us are going to be the healers. Some of us are going to be the teachers or whatever. So kind of thinking about what role you are most suited to play can help you sort of rationalize that. And then the whole, in terms of the whole divide and conquer, there are so many stories about ways in which people have overcome that kind of divisive rhetoric. And so I think telling those stories means a lot. So the story about Larry Itliong bringing Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta together to form the stronger, what ultimately became the farm workers movement, right? The Union of Farm Workers. Whereas, had they been kept separate, which was the, grape workers and the vineyard owner's intent, that movement would have fizzled. So there's so many stories about how people have come together in spite of that divisive rhetoric. So, pick a story, tell it, and, don't let people keep us apart.
Yeah, I'll chime in here as well, just to add on to what Ben just mentioned there. And this is more in direct response to that third question around like the wedge and kind of, living in a very divisive kind of environment. I think about three things. One is, and these things are not kind of like super profound. These are themes of what has been mentioned from the other panelists already, but I really think about like whenever I'm in a space, whether it's with my dad or community members, my cousins who have very different political ideology as me, I oftentimes have to lean into curiosity and really like listen to understand and not listen to react and respond. That's been like, again, it's not like super profound. It's helped. It's helped to create space for people to kind of like really like tease out like what they're trying to say and how they're trying to say it. And so that's been like a small strategy that I've been able to use that has had, I would say, like generally more positive reactions from people that want to like debate about stuff, right? Another strategy, and I've mentioned this before, is like being willing to unlearn certain things, whether it's like unconscious bias and taking time to reflect on those things, whether it's unlearning some of the rhetoric that's kind of like being spread amongst like social media, just like being willing to take time to really like expand your self-awareness so that you're better able to understand yourself, but yourself in relation to other people, and then unlearn some of those behaviors, some of those thought patterns that might perpetuate inequities amongst other people that exist within intersectionalities. And then the third thing I'm thinking about is kind of what Ben just said, is like being willing to tell your story or tell stories, right? I think that's the best way that I've learned how to become a stronger ally. That's how people have learned how to become a stronger ally to like the Hmong refugee, like in me, right? That struggled through school, that got put on academic probation, that didn't know how to apply for financial aid, that, you know, like people were able to tell their stories. I was able to connect with them, build that trust. And then now I'm able to tell certain stories and articulate certain stories that hopefully are able to kind of create different connection points for you all, right? So that's more in direct response to that final question. I didn't write the first two down, but I think my fellow panelists were able to kind of respond to some of those, but I'll pause there.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're pivoting to a question from one of our virtual attendees, Akiko. So Akiko says, hello, and thank you so much for sharing such powerful words. You mentioned to not watch the news too much because it can cause a lot of disillusionment. At the same time, it's so important to be cognizant of the issues and genocides occurring around the world, to stay informed in order to actively combat imperialism and racism. What are some of your self-care practices and ways to take care of mental health while staying politically involved?
I can jump that one off. So yes, definitely agree that you definitely want to watch it. But what I find out is that they repeat the same thing every hour. So just yeah. But I would say for me, self-care is really about I think one of the things that's been helpful for me is to have my circle of friends that I can go to when I need to actually just let my guard down. Because when you're doing this work, I feel like we have to be optimistic. We have to think about, okay, what is the opportunity? And you don't want to sulk too much in, the crisis or the negativity that's happening, because then it kind of impacts how you're engaging into the work. And so I think it's important to have your circle of friends that you can just, even if it's just getting some things off your chest and saying, this frustrates me, and just getting it off, because then you have to like get back down, roll your sleeves back up and get back to it. I also think that as far as self-care, that I find that it's important to have counseling, just to be able to talk through some of the things that's happening. You never know how some of the work that you do may impact you personally. And so I think counseling is something that I would recommend, just as a way to, again, to have safe space. I also think it's important to utilize your vacation time. Like seriously, like utilize your vacation time, take breaks. You need to take breaks and be able to invest in yourselves and to do the self-care for yourself. I think it's also good to just find different ways for you to give your brain just that break. And so whether that's doing fitness, it could be reading a book, whatever it is, I think it's important for you to find those ways to do that. Try to stay optimistic, because like I said, there's a long list of things that we can complain about. There's a long list of things that is going on in our society, but there's also a lot of good things. And so don't go down the pipeline on social media of all the negative things that's happening. Be intentional, look for some of the good things that's happening out here. Really appreciate the wins that you see in your work, because like I said, we're trying to address solutions that are deeply rooted into our society. And so when we have those wins, that is to me awesome. Like to see the impact of your work on a day-to-day basis. Like, I will say nonprofits do a lot of work that are in some ways just honestly band-aids to the issues that's happening in our communities. They are. But guess what? Those band-aids are those wins, and those band-aids are real solutions for real families in their moments of need. And so while we're still working on these long-term solutions, there's short-term things we need to do. So give that just as much energy as we give those long-term things. And lastly, I would just say is enjoy each other, like celebrate each other. Don't only come together in crisis. Come together in celebration. Let's be intentional about it. Let's just create our own opportunities to engage with each other in a way where it's actually just not even about work, but just getting to know each other as people, as human beings. You know, I think I think we need to have those intentional spaces to be able to do the hard work of understanding how we're all coming to this work, but we are all individuals. We're all people, right? So everything don't have to be structured, you know? So go out and just have dinner sometimes and, you know, just just have fun. You know, like, don't get bowed down and overworked like some of us do. I am truly a workaholic, and I've worked really hard to stop being one. So don't do that. In the nonprofit sector, that's very easy to do. Don't do it. Don't work on the weekends. Don't do it.
Can I add?
Yes.
So workaholic, recovering.
Yes.
I'm a recovering angry activist. So when I started my work, we was mad. I was young and mad, and I just wanted to, and then I burned out.
Yeah.
Because you can only be angry for only angry for so long, right? To Ebony's points about joy and fun and play, right? Those are a part of our liberation too. I want a world where Black kids can play. That's actually the world. So how do I create it now, right? So living into those things. And one of the things that I've been trying to reframe for myself around like self-care is no longer looking at self-care as something I do, but something I am. So I am a person who cares for myself, right? As opposed to a thing I need to do for maintenance. So then it takes me to, so what do I do? My rituals, my practices that keep me well daily. Do I journal? Do I think about gratitudes? Do I take a walk? Do I spend time with my dog? Like whatever those like micro things are that you can build into your everyday life. Because as we were just talking about, the crisis is everywhere. So whether you're watching the news or not, we are feeling it. We can feel it at an energetic level. We can see it in our daily lives. So it's finding us. So I think it is just being consistent around learning how to care for ourselves and care for others simultaneously, and allowing that hope and joy to carry us forward.
When I first moved to DC, I hate the narrative of DC as a transient city. But I bought into it when I first moved here. I was like, yeah, nobody stays here very long anyway. But I think if you discover your passion, you discover your joy, it helps keep you here despite working too hard. For me, when I was in my 20s, it was gay volleyball. You know, like that kept me here. That brought me joy. I'm older now. I probably should get back to the leagues, but I do karaoke now. So, you know, I think like it helps keep you grounded, like in your personhood, but also in your space, you know, like I would not have been here. I moved here in the 90s, so do the math. Even though I said, oh, I'll just stay here for a couple of years. But yeah, no, so I think it's really important to find what outside the workplace brings you joy.
Final questions before we send it over to Karim?
Okay. Well, Ben, Bianca, Chingcha, Ebony, thank you all so much for your time, your thoughtfulness, your energy, and frankly, the work that you do, because we need you, and hopefully we're cultivating the next generation of folks who will be sitting here to lead us in a direction of resilience and power building and community building. And to folks who are in the room, if you enjoyed our WLP session today, we have one more session for you. WLPs are on Wednesdays from 6 to 7:30 Eastern, both in person and virtually. And we have our next and final WLP session on the 2024 elections. It is going to be on July 31st, where we'll discuss topics surrounding our community as a voting bloc, which is very, very, very important. The various pathways you can take to get involved in the electoral process, whether it be from organizing to voter mobilization to voter registration, etc., and address how do we actually mobilize our voters to show up in their communities, given the current political climate that we're in, which we know is fraught, which is tenuous, which is perilous, but is also hopeful. And it is a moment of transformation, of generational transformation, of leadership transformation. So I hope you will register and join us. Our website is capal.org. All of our events are also on our social media. So if you follow at CAPAL DC, you'll see it on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, etc. And before we wrap, I do want to say a big, big, big thank you to our 2024 sponsors, including a special thank you to MOAPIA and Ben and his team, because if it wasn't for the mayor's office, we would not be able to do this incredible programming. And for that, we are incredibly grateful to Mayor Bowser and everyone on the team. To our panelists, if you could just take a couple more minutes, we're going to take a quick group picture with everyone who's here in the room. And we hope to see the rest of you at our next and final session next Wednesday. And please continue to stay involved, continue to stay engaged. We need you in public service. The world will be better because of your service and your talents. So keep doing what you're doing. And thank you for joining us.